Introducing. The Beatles is the first Beatles album released in the United States. Originally scheduled for a July 1963 release, the LP came out on January 10, 1964, on Vee-Jay Records, 10 days before Capitol's Meet The Beatles. The later album, however, entered the U.S. album chart 1 week before the former. Consequently, when Meet The Beatles peaked at number 1 for 11 consecutive weeks, introducing. The Beatles stalled at number 2 where it remained 9 consecutive weeks. It was the subject of much legal wrangling, but ultimately, Vee-Jay were permitted to sell the album until late 1964, by which time it had sold more than 1.3 million copies. On July 24, 2014 the album was certified gold and platinum by the RIAA. Initial non-release, the Beatles' recording contract that began May 1962 with Parlophone in the United Kingdom gave the parent corporation EMI rights to offer any of the group's recordings to the labels EMI owned in many countries of the free world. However, the United States EMI label, Capitol Records of Hollywood, turned down release of the Please Please Me single. Following this, Transglobal, an EMI affiliate that worked to place foreign masters with U.S. record labels, negotiated with several labels before Vee-Jay Records signed a licensing agreement giving it the right of first refusal on Beatles records for 5 years. As part of that agreement, even after its singles releases of Please Please Me, and From Me to You failed to chart above number 116 on the Billboard Hot 100, Vee-Jay planned to release the Please Please Me album in the US, and received copies of the mono and stereo master tapes in late April or early May 1963. Originally, Vee-Jay considered releasing Please Please Me as it appeared in the United Kingdom. A surviving acetate made by Universal Recording Corporation of Chicago, probably in May 1963, contains all 14 songs in the same order as on the UK album, with the title still listed as Please Please Me. But in keeping with the American norm of a 12-song album, Vee-Jay chose instead to omit Please Please Me, and Ask Me Why, and change the album's title to Introducing. The Beatles. Also, the engineer at Universal in Chicago thought that Paul McCartney's count-in at the start of I Saw Her Standing There was extraneous rather than intentionally placed there, so he snipped the 1, 2, 3 from Vee-Jay's mono and stereo masters. Except for those omissions, the order and contents of the album were untouched, resulting in a US album that bore the closest resemblance to a British Beatles LP until Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. Preparations for the LP's release continued in late June and early July 1963, including the manufacturing of masters and metal parts and the printing of 6,000 front covers. But, despite the claims of many older books that Introducing. The Beatles was first released on July 22, 1963. No paper trail exists to suggest that the album was released at any time in 1963. After a management shake-up at Vee-Jay, which included the resignation of company president Walt Abner after he used company funds to cover gambling debts, the label cancelled the release of Introducing. The Beatles as well as albums by Frank Ifield, Alma Cogan and a Jewish cantor. Version 1, Vee-Jay's financial problems forced it to take care of its most pressing debt first. Because the Beatles and Ifield were low priorities, the label chose not to report royalties on their sales. As a result, Transglobal declared its contract with Vee-Jay null and void on August 8, 1963. The next single, She Loves You, was licensed by Transglobal to the Swan label of Philadelphia. On December 14, 1963, Billboard magazine mentioned that Capitol Records planned an all-out promotional campaign for the Beatles in the United States. Following that, the single I Want to Hold Your Hand was rush-released on December 26. On January 7, 1964, Vee-Jay's board of directors met for the first time since the single was released, and it discussed the Beatles' material it had in the vault. Desperate for cash, the board decided to release Introducing. The Beatles, even if it meant legal trouble in the future. Metal parts were already at Vee-Jay's 3 primary pressing plants, and 6,000 front covers were already printed. But it had no back cover prepared. So, as a stopgap, The label used a back cover slick made from one side of his standard inner sleeve, consisting of full-color reproductions of the covers of 25 other fine albums of significant interest. This cover is known by collectors as the add-back version and is highly sought after. A second stopgap back cover was used when the add-back slicks were exhausted. Because it is all white with no printing at all, it is known by collectors as the blank back edition and is also very rare. Finally, third editions contain Vee-Jay's official back cover, with Introducing The Beatles near the top and the song titles in 2 columns underneath. All of these were available on the market within days of the 10th January release date. Also in January, Please Please Me was reissued as a single, this time with From Me to You as the B-side. But on January 16, 1964, less than a week after Introducing The Beatles was released, Vee-Jay was served with a restraining order stopping further distribution. Beechwood Music, Incorporated, Capitol Records publishing subsidiary, owned the American publishing rights to Love Me Do, and P.S. I Love You, and because the 2 songs had not yet been officially released in the U.S., Beechwood refused to issue a license for Vee-Jay to release them. Approximately 80,000 copies of Introducing The Beatles had been released with the 2 songs on them, with only 2,000 or so in stereo. Version 2, to circumvent the restraining order, Vee-Jay quickly reconfigured Introducing The Beatles. It removed Love Me Do, and P.S. I Love You, and replaced them with the previously omitted Ask Me Why, and Please Please Me, though some pressings of the album did not alter the track list. The new versions were prepared in late January and began appearing in stores around February 10, 1964. Because of the initial restraining order, version 2 of Introducing The Beatles did not enter the Billboard charts until 3 weeks after Capitol's Meet the Beatles album. Once it did, it quickly rose to the number 2 spot, where it stayed for 9 straight weeks. It also peaked at number 2 in Cashbox, and it got to number 1 in Record World magazine. This success inspired a host of other Vee-Jay releases. First came the album Jolly What? England's Greatest Recording Stars, The Beatles and Frank Ifield on Stage issued on February 26, containing the Beatles tracks Please Please Me, From Me to You, Ask Me Why, and Thank You Girl from the 1963 singles and Introducing, and other tracks from Frank Ifield. The re-released single Please Please Me rose to number 3 on the Hot 100, Cashbox and Record World. Soon after, Twist and Shout was released March 2 on the subsidiary Tolly label with There's a Place as the B-side, and Do You Want to Know a Secret, with Thank You Girl on the B-side, was issued on March 23. Both singles went up to number 2 on the Hot 100, with Twist and Shout reaching number 1 on both Cashbox and Record World. Also a Beatles EP titled Souvenir of Their Visit to America was released by Vee-Jay on March 23, featuring Misery, A Taste of Honey, Ask Me Why, and Anna. Even with the replacement of the 2 Beechwood Music songs, Vee-Jay and Capitol battled in court throughout the early part of 1964. Injunctions against Vee-Jay's album were issued, lifted and restored more than once. Because the album was often pressed quickly between restraining orders, there are almost 24 different label variations, including mono and stereo copies, manufactured at numerous pressing plants. Finally, on April 9, 1964, the 2 labels settled. Vee-Jay was granted a license giving it the right to issue the 16 Beatles songs it controlled, in any way it saw fit, until October 15, 1964. At that time, its license expired, and all rights would revert to Capitol. During the time Introducing The Beatles was available, it sold approximately 1,300,000 mono copies and approximately 41,000 stereo copies. Because only 3.1% of all of the LPs were in stereo, true stereo copies are rare. After the settlement, the Beechwood songs were issued by Vee-Jay as a single, on April 27 on Tolly. Love Me Do/P.S. I Love You rose to become the Beatles' 4th number 1 single on Billboard and their 5th on both Cashbox and Record World. Other versions, twice before its license expired, Vee-Jay repackaged Introducing The Beatles Although neither album contained any new music, both of them made the Billboard album charts. Vee-Jay 1092 . One of these was Songs, Pictures and Stories of the Fabulous Beatles 1092, which featured a three-quarters gatefold cover, portrait paintings of the four musicians and the text, "Look Inside." Complete story of their favorite male and female singer, their favorite foods, types of girls, sport, hobby, songs, colors, real name, birthplace, birthdays, height, education, color of hair and eyes. The inside cover text describes Paul as the nut Beatle, or Beatle nut, John as nearsighted, and the chief Beatle, George as the quietest, and the one with the deadpan face, and Ringo as the shortest Beatle, who will send his steak back if it is not blood red. The back sleeve shows outlines of hearts below each Beatle photo and holds instructions of how to fill the hearts with personal photos. The record inside the cover did not even contain the new name. It still stated Introducing the Beatles on the label. Songs, Pictures and Stories was released either in late July 1964 or 12 October 1964, with the latter the more likely date, because it entered the Billboard album chart on October 31. It eventually peaked at number 63. Vee-Jay 1065 . The other repackaging was the two-record set The Beatles vs. The Four Seasons, which contained copies of Introducing the Beatles in one pocket of the gatefold cover and Golden Hits of the Four Seasons in the other. This Vee-Jay creation spent 3 weeks on the Billboard chart in October 1964 and peaked at number 142. Though Vee-Jay could not manufacture or distribute any Beatles product after October 15, 1964, it took a long time for the records to vanish from retail stores. Both Introducing the Beatles and Songs, Pictures and Stories of the Fabulous Beatles remained on the Billboard LP chart until January 9, 1965. After Vee-Jay license expired, the early Beatles, Rarities from the start of Beatlemania in the United States until the October 1964 expiration of its rights to Beatles music, Vee-Jay issued 4 LP albums, 4 singles, and an EP out of the 16 tracks it gained from its 1963 license period. On March 22, 1965, Capitol issued the early Beatles, which contained 11 of the 14 tracks that had previously been issued on Introducing the Beatles. Misery, and There's a Place, 2 of the other 3 songs, would not make their Capitol Records LP debut until 1980, on the US version of Rarities. The other Introducing song was I Saw Her Standing There, first released in the UK on the Please Please Me LP. The song appeared in the US on both the Vee-Jay album as well as Capitol's Meet The Beatles LP. These 2 albums marked the only time that 2 different Beatles albums, each from a different record label, were released in the same month with one song appearing on both albums. There is a difference between the 2 tracks in that Paul's count-off is cut short on the Vee-Jay release by 3 numbers, leaving only 4 on the intro. Later, in the summer of 1964, Capitol would release something new in the United States with 5 songs that had already appeared on the American A Hard Day's Night soundtrack album released by United Artists Records about 1 month earlier. Introducing the Beatles has never been officially released on compact disc in America, although imported pirate copies have circulated from other countries in both mono and stereo versions, mostly with the version 2 lineup. Counterfeits. Starting in the late 1960s and continuing through the 1990s, Introducing the Beatles was frequently counterfeited. These counterfeits can be identified by the cover printing and quality, the label, or the sound quality. Counterfeits have some significant differences from the commercial issue. Some of the more common variations include labels with the title of the album and the group's name separated by the center spindle hole, labels with color bands that are off-center and or missing the color green, labels with large white brackets, album covers with dark brown borders, dating from the late 1970s, George Harrison's shadow is not visible on the right side of the cover. Nearly all fakes claim to be in stereo. As legitimate stereo copies of Introducing the Beatles are rare, the majority of copies with stereo, or stereophonic printed on the cover are counterfeits. There are also known fake versions of songs, pictures, and stories of the Fabulous Beatles. These counterfeits often omit stories from the album title, since they are circulated without the gatefold cover and the text inside, renaming it Songs and Pictures of the Fabulous Beatles. These versions have 3 songs not on the original album. From Me to You, Love Me Do, and P.S. I Love You, which opens side 2 rather than Please Please Me. Track listing: all songs written and composed by Lennon/McCartney, except where noted. Personnel: The Beatles, John Lennon rhythm guitar, harmonica, vocals, George Harrison lead guitar, vocals, Paul McCartney bass guitar, vocals, Ringo Starr drums, vocals, production, George Martin producer. Charts and certifications. Notes. References. External links: Bruce Baez's songs, pictures and stories of the Fabulous Beatles records on Vee-Jay website, The Beatles on Vee-Jay Records.